Hello and welcome to another Magic the Gathering video. Today I'm going to be doing an analysis of the Solitary Fiends deck, which is a deck I did an unboxing of a day or so ago. So this particular deck plays around the concept of having one creature in play, and it has cards in it which exploit or give you bonuses based on the fact that you have one creature in play. There isn't a specific mechanic in the set to do that. It's not like Soul Bond, but what it really is, I suppose, is a way of exploring a flavour concept within the set. So, as I've said, I think this is a blue-black deck, island swamps, slightly more swamps than islands, just 2 more. There's 24 lands in total, 11 islands, 13 swamps. It's a creature-based deck, but it doesn't have an over amount of creatures, like say with the Soul Bond deck. There are a good deal of non-creature support cards. And in addition to the creatures, there also are a number of cards which work well with those particular creatures in a number of different ways. So I've organised this out as I normally organise it now. So I've got the creatures over here, and also creature related actually cards, running from 1 mana through to 6 casting cost. And then here we have our support cards, and then obviously our mana base. Again, with this deck, I think it's important to just try a few sample hands, see how the colour works within the sort of blue-black, and then if you run into any colour related problems, start looking at ways of possibly fixing that. Within standard at the moment, there's a couple of cards that help you fix for mana, and really they are very much dependent on the speed of the deck, and also whether you've got any awkward casting cost cards at certain mana costs. So you need to just consider whether these would fit in best within this deck. But I'll just give you both of them, and then you can sort of decide really how you think as you sort of think through the deck, and maybe play around with it if you've got a copy of this deck. So you've got Dark Slick Shores from Scars of Mirrodin. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other land cards or other lands. Now, that sort of card, the way it's worded, is really good if you're trying to fix mana early on. So you've got to have a reason to do that. So if you've got an explosive deck that uses multicolours, and you want to definitely make sure that you're not getting colour screwed really early on in the game, then that's probably the card to use. However, if you've got a slower deck, then there may be no advantage in using that Dark Slick Shores. And when you look at this, it's interesting to note there doesn't appear to be any 1-drops in this deck at all, so that's something to think about. There's also Drowned Catacombs, which is from M12, also for blue-black. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. So it's really good for fixing colours when you've already got colours in play, particularly if you've got a lot of one colour and nothing else. So that would be good in that sort of scenario. Evolving Wilds, which is a fetchland that you can also use, will obviously slow the deck down, but I want to talk about that a bit later when I come round to talking about other issues within this particular deck. So that's our mana base. We then move on to our sort of non-creature support cards. This is a really interesting package actually they've got in this deck, and a lot of people that have sort of online that are commentating on this deck, I've seen mention that it's quite unusual to see a sort of control based mechanic in an intro deck. And in order to play this deck well, you do have to maintain control, because you can imagine if you don't, with just one creature on the board, you can be easily overwhelmed on here. So I've just organised these by blue and black, going from lowest mana cost to highest. So we've got a mixture here as well, generally, of instants, sorceries and some enchantments. So the instant at the top here is Peel from Reality, so we'll take a quick look at this. So this is going to give you some control. You return a target creature you control and a target creature you don't control to their owner's hands. So obviously it's going to deal with a threat on your opponent's side, but also it's going to allow you to thin out your creatures on the board so you get back to having a single creature. Then we've got Frost Breath. So this allows you to tap up to 2 target creatures, and these creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. So you can sort of tap down an opponent's creatures here to prevent them using for a period of time. And obviously that's going to interact with some of your other creatures, allowing you to attack whilst their creatures are tapped down. We got another instant here in the form of Crippling Chill. So another one that allows us to tap. This one allows us to tap a single target creature, but it also has card draw on it. And there's 2 of those. Into the Void, Sorcery Speed here, and with this one it will allow us to return up to 2 target creatures to our owners, their owner's hand. Again, just be careful when you're using this. You know what the limitations are of sorcery speed and when it can or can't be played. So basically instants can be played basically any time, including during combat phase and on your opponent's turn, whereas sorceries can't be played during combat and can't be played during an opponent's turn. So it's a good thing to bear in mind if you're sort of trying to bounce a creature, which is what this does. You get the timing right, because this deck is really all about timing. Looking at the black, we've got a couple of Doom Blades. So this is pretty classic removal for destroying a target non-black creature, and there's 2 of those. Then we move on to an enchantment here. So this is going to sit on the board. It's not like an instant or sorcery where we cast it and then it sort of resolves and ends up in our graveyard. This is going to stay on the board until it's dealt with, until it could be removed. At the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent discards a card if you control the creature with the greatest power or tied for the greatest power. So of course the idea here is to take your lone creature and just ensure that it's got higher power than your opponent's creatures, or it's tied. So this is another important point when you're playing this deck, is to be really aware of the sort of curve, and when you're playing your creatures, when that card is basically on the board, to get the maximum benefit out of the discard that's attached to that card. We've got Essence Harvest. So this is a sorcery. Target player loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the greatest power among the creatures you control. So it's another one that's dependent on power to get the maximum out of this. So again, it's just careful timing on this card. Homicidal Seclusion is another enchantment, and this is very much based on the concept of the deck. So this one, as long as you control exactly one creature, that creature gets +3/+1 and has lifelink on it. So once that's on the battlefield, that's going to be sitting there triggering, as long as you have one creature in play, exactly one creature in play. Then we move on to this section. So the first thing is actually enchantment. As I've said, there's no, apart from this is the only 1-drop. There's no 1-drop creatures in this deck. This is it basically. And of course, because it's a creature enchantment, in effect you can't really play it until there's something to attach it to. So enchants a creature, and the enchanted creature gets +2/+1. Also, there's a conditional ability on this, where it has an intimidate as long as its controller controls no other creatures. And that intimidate is obviously based on the colour. So if it's a blue creature you're attaching it to, then it can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a colour. So in that case it would be a blue creature. Okay, so now we move on to the creatures themselves. We've got 3 Alchemist's Apprentice in this deck. So with this one, it's a 1/1 for 1 and a blue. So it's sort of below the curve. But what you can do with it is, once it's sort of fulfilled its usefulness, you can sacrifice it and you get to replace it by drawing a card. So it's useful in that respect, is once it's if you've fulfilled its objectives using it and it becomes surplus to requirements, you can get rid of it, draw another card. So it's going to keep the board clean in terms of you trying to get these sort of single creatures out that have much more effect later in the game. There's also a Crypt Keeper in here, interesting inclusion. So this is a 2/1 for 1 and a black. It's interesting because of its ability, so you can sacrifice it and then you can use it to basically remove a target card from a graveyard. So this could deal with an opponent's card that you don't want sitting in their graveyard, and that will exile it. Then we move on to some equipment here. So we've got Tormentor's Trident. So this will give a creature +3/+0 and forces it to attack each turn if able. Costs 2 to cast it and 3 to equip on that. So obviously you're not going to be able to get that into usage, although you get it into a play on the second turn. You won't be able to use it because you've still got to equip it for 3. Then we've got Swiftfoot Boots, which is 2 to play and 1 to equip, so a slightly lesser equip cost on this. Gives the equipped creature hexproof and haste, so very useful within this deck. There's only one of those. Moving on to the rest of the creatures here, we've got a Fettergeist, which is a 2 colourless and a blue. It's got flying for a 3 and it's a 3/4. This sort of conduces you to try and keep your creature count down, because at the beginning of your upkeep you have to sacrifice this unless you pay 1 colourless for each other creature you control. We have Undead Executioner, which is a 3 and a black for 2/2. When Undead Executioner dies, you may have target creature get -2/-2 until end of turn. Okay, so obviously there's 2 ways this can die. One is through your opponent killing it. So in effect, it's making them think about removing this, because you could then use it to get rid of one of their creatures that was too tough or less. And there's 2 of those. The other thing it can be used in this deck is there's an interaction between that and Corpse Traders. The Corpse Trader card, which is a 3/3 for 3 and a black, has an ability on it where you pay 2 and a black and you sacrifice a creature, in this case, in this example, Undead Executioner. You then get to look at a target opponent's hand and choose a card from it and then discard it. You activate the ability only any time you cast a sorcery, but you can actually activate it as many times as you like in a turn, as long as you've got enough mana to do that. So with 2 and a black, if you wanted to activate this twice, then that's going to be 4 colourless and at least 2 black in order to play that. But as I said, because if you use it to sacrifice, you use the Undead Executioner as your sack outlet, this -2/-2 thing triggers on the Undead Executioner. So again, with this is where timing is important again, because what you want to do is to get the most out of that particular combination. You want to make sure that you know, your opponent has actually got enough cards in their hand that are actually worth looking at, and also you've got a target for this -2/-2. And we have Mist Raven. So this thing will basically bounce stuff when it comes into play. It has flying, so 2/2 for 2 colourless and 2 blue. When it enters the battlefield, you return a target creature to its owner's hand. So you can use it on your own creatures to bounce them out, and obviously you can use it on your opponent to bounce your creatures back into their hand. So of course the only thing about this is once this comes into play, if you weren't bouncing your own creature, you know, you had no reason to do that because this wasn't as good as the creature that was currently in play. You've now got 2 creatures, so any abilities that were benefiting from having a single creature no longer apply. We've got 2 Renegade Demons, which are what's this? 5/3 for 3 and 2 black. No other ability on it. Marrow Bats, which is a fairly brittle 4/1 for 4 and a black, so pretty easy to kill this. High power versus the toughness. Does have flying on it. Its regenerate cost, well, you've got to pay 4 life to regenerate this, so pretty high to get this back if you need to do that. 2 of those. Then the foil in here is the Lone Revenant. So this has hexproof on it. It's 4/4, 3 and 2 blue to cast. Whenever it deals combat damage, so this is the interesting ability. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, if you control no other creature, so this needs to be the lone creature in play, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So basically it's saying look at 4 cards, pick one, put that in your hand, stick the rest on the bottom of the library. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because there is a problem in this deck with various things, and that is one of them, I think. Demonic Rising isn't a creature, but it does generate a creature, and it generates a creature if you only control one creature. In some ways this card is sort of self-defeating, in that of course as soon as you create that second creature, this enchantment won't trigger again until you're back to just having one creature in play. It puts a 5/5 black demon creature token with flying into the battlefield, so you could argue that you could play a bit fast and loose with that black flying 5/5 black demon with flying, and not worry, because if it gets sort of killed, then you go back to one creature at the beginning of your next end step, this is going to trigger again and produce you another one. And then finally we've got Havengull Scab, which is a creature zombie horror. It's 5 and a blue, gives you a 4/5. Whenever Havengull Scab attacks, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. So if you're attacking with this, it's working in the area of basically reducing down the number of creatures in play. So again, timing's important on this. You don't want to end up bouncing another creature that's really useful. Although of course you're bouncing it, so you could recast it, but of course that's going to incur a cost to cast. Okay, so one or two things that are worth flagging up about this deck. Firstly is the issue of the single creature. So what the deck tries to do really is either reward you for having one creature in play, or punish you, or tries to facilitate having one creature in play. And so that's what it's sort of moving towards here. So that's why when you're sort of playing any card which either punishes you or facilitates that, the timing is obviously really important, because you don't want it punishing you at a totally wrong point, and you don't want whatever is facilitated happening at a completely wrong point as well. Now the other thing is the issue of the Lone Revenant. So what you've got is a situation where you're filtering quite heavily cards. Now, so firstly you've got to be in a position where you're dealing combat damage to a player. That could happen if you, say, had attached Predator's Gambit to the Lone Revenant there, so you've enchanted it, you've given it +2/+1, so that would make it a 6/5. And also it has an Intimidate, so as long as your opponent didn't have a blue creature of some description, or didn't have some way of removing this, then you know that's going to get through, and you're going to get your sort of filtering effect. Now the problem is what happens to those cards the 3 cards that you've stuck on the bottom. You've effectively got to wait for them to come back up again, because this is the problem with this deck. There's no tutoring in this deck. There's no shuffling, so you can't sort of suddenly think, oh, maybe I should shuffle my deck and try and redistribute the cards that I've stuck down the bottom. So this is where I was thinking about Evolving Wilds. You know, if that was an issue in the deck, something like an Evolving Wilds played strategically could be used to cause a deck shuffle after you'd gone and hunted that deck, but again played at a point in which it's not affecting the tempo too much. And that's another issue, leads on to another issue with this deck, I think, the issue of what I would call lazy creatures. Because you've only got one creature in play, or you're aiming to have one creature in play, you've got a lot of these creatures which are basically sitting around not doing an awful lot. They're sitting, you know, in your library, they're sitting in your hand, they could also be sitting in the graveyard, because it's quite possible, again, how you play this deck, your turnover of creatures could be quite high. And because of that, you know, you're building up all these creatures in the graveyard, and there's no way in this deck of exploiting that. So that's another thing that you might want to look at, is either cards that are going to return you creatures from the graveyard, and again you need to look at what's here and say, well, when I sub that out, is it a better card than the one I'm taking out? Or anything in sort of blue or black. So we're looking for basically blue or black or colours cards that interact with the graveyard. But equally, any card which exploits the fact I've got a lot of creatures in the graveyard. So I'm thinking of cards which say things like, this creature gains power or toughness equal to the number of creatures in the graveyard, or the number of power of creatures in the graveyard, that sort of thing. If there's anything like that, and you find that you're ending up with lots of creatures in the graveyard, that's going to be, I think, a worthwhile inclusion in the deck without interfering with this single creature concept. And that's the important thing, is, you don't want to really, if you're playing this deck for its flavour, then it's silly to mess with that flavour. You might as well just completely redesign the deck and go with a completely different concept if you're going to do that. So the other thing you might want to look at is, is there anything out there which allows me to manipulate my library a bit more? If I'm going to be sticking, these, when I use the Lone Revenant, how much does it occur that I'm going to be sticking 3 cards on the bottom Does that happen a lot, or does it not happen a lot? If it happens a lot, how do I need to manipulate my deck so if there's a card there that I did want in addition to the one that I chose, then I can somehow get that card back again. If I've got a lot of creatures that are just stuck in my hand, is there something I can play around with hand size in order to just mean that I'm not discarding creatures and then I've got nothing that's going to bring them back from the graveyard? So again, just stuff to sort of think about when you're doing this. So looking at the deck as a whole as it stands, obviously things like the Triumph of Cruelty and the Homicidal Seclusion interact with the creatures, and particularly the Homicidal Solution is based on you having only one creature in play. Equally, the Predator's Gambit, only one creature in play. The others are like Triumph of Cruelty and things like Essence Harvest. It's obviously important to make sure you have a creature that's where it's supposed to be at a certain time in terms of the number of turns you've taken. It's on curve or better than on curve, so that there's a high likelihood you're going to have the best creature on the board between both yourself and your opponent with the highest power, so you can sort of exploit those cards. The largest sort of control package is obviously there because there may be some problems early on in the game in terms of how you deal with the fact that your opponent could have more creatures out than you. Well, actually all through the game if you're just playing a single creature, but it may also take you a little while to sort of manipulate your creatures into a position where you've got the most effective creature for what you want to do. So this is why this sort of thing is really important. I've heard modifications like this, things like using things like Descend into Madness, which are going to sort of ruin your opponent's side of the board more than they would ruin yours because of your sort of lack of permanence generally, I suppose, but particularly creatures. The other thing is there is a planeswalker in the set called Tamio the Moon Sage, which it would definitely be worthwhile looking at, because that sort of manipulates and interacts with areas of the game which are going to be conducive to this sort of single creature concept on there. So yeah, I think it's an interesting deck to play around with the concept. How good that concept is another matter, and I think really it does need work on looking at, like I said, this concept of the lazy creature is just finding how you can make out the most of having creatures that are effectively, for most of the time, doing nothing if they're not actually sitting in play on the battlefield. Okay, thanks for watching.